So we've got about 70 odd people, I think, on the call just at the moment. But yes, please, Rob, because we don't want to hold people up.
Great stuff. So welcome to this event, which has been put together by the West Yorkshire and Harrogate Healthcare Partnership. We're an integrated care system made up of councils, the NHS, third sector organisations and communities. And, we exist to ensure that we can deliver the best outcomes possible with local people. And in doing that, we're very ambitious. And part of our ambitions are to make sure that we always try and challenge ourselves with external voices and people working with us to ensure that we making as much progress as possible. So thanks for coming along to today's event. We've got a range of speakers who we will introduce as we go along. I'm co-chairing this event with Hilary Thompson, which I'm very grateful for. As an emergency at home means I'm going to have to drop out for about an hour of this session. So Hilary will take over for some of that period. Just a bit of etiquette, I think, before we start. So we've got a packed programme, as Karen has said, with some fantastic speakers, all of them experts in their own field, some of them of international renown, and all of them with some fantastic insights to give us. If we're going to get the best out of the session, I think we're all getting used to operating in this digital environment now. So the etiquette for today is, if you're not speaking, please mute your microphone. If you do want to speak, then raise your hand. If you have a comment, use the chat function. The chat function's been a really fantastic way of engaging in debate during the conversation. There is specific time for questions, and in the Q&A sessions we will pick some themes from the chat box, or we'll ask people who've raised their hand to ask a question. And there's a conversation at the end to pick up too. That's it. That's the etiquette. As we're not all in situ, then you have to make your own arrangements about where the toilets are and where the fire exit is and all of that sort of stuff. But I'm sure you know that already. Coming into this session, I'm just really grateful for the array of speakers that we've got today. Some of them have worked with us before as a system leadership executive, and have helped really to embed our view, I think, that we have to get things done by people in our system of West Yorkshire and Harrogate as part of a range of processes which are going to ensure that we improve health outcomes, reduce health inequalities, manage unwarranted variation, and do everything we can with our resources. If we're going to do that, then a thriving third sector, which is often born of people's frustrations about a lack of access to services that are tailored to meet their needs, then a thriving third sector is essential. And we'll return to that theme today. So I'm going to ask Hilary to introduce some thoughts on why this is so important, what we think is happening in the state of the third sector and with engagement in our communities today during this COVID crisis and beyond. And this COVID crisis, for everybody on the call, I think would reinforce the power of people and the power of the assets that people have, because the people have been magnificent in rising to the challenge that have faced them in their homes, their neighbourhoods and their communities. So Hilary, over to you.
Thanks, Rob. It's a very surreal situation, isn't it? Somebody said to me 4 months ago, you'd be sitting in your spare bedroom talking to 70 people at your computer on the middle of a Friday afternoon. I just said they were mad. The voluntary sector has never really been more important than now to push the better health and wellbeing plan that is the ambition across this West Yorkshire and Harrogate patch. But we mustn't forget that the voluntary sector has been doing this sort of work for generations. And sometimes it just takes a crisis for people to recognise the tremendous assets of the community, the people, its organisations in there. And as perhaps this new saying goes, volunteering isn't just for Christmas or for COVID-19. It goes on and it goes on. We have to be acknowledged as part of the wider health sector, and the NHS plan brings us to that. And it highlights the role of volunteers in tackling social exclusion and supporting the most isolated and the most vulnerable in our communities. We've just commissioned and had published a report about the resilience of the local voluntary sector. It's called the Third Sector Resilience in West Yorkshire and Harrogate before and during COVID-19. We've learnt some important lessons from it. It reflects how the communities have turned to the voluntary sector during this time and the part that the sector's played in that response of the crisis, and that it is most importantly still playing. It's highlighted that the significant financial pressures to the VCS because of the loss of income and the fragility of the sector. And it has also shown that 83% of the voluntary sector that replied have had to change their services in order to help the needs of the people. So many of our sector, it's run entirely on volunteers, and the pressure that has been inevitable over the last few weeks and months, but it does show the community passion and the resilience of that sector. We are following up on some of the financial difficulties, and some people are coming through this and adapting their services. And one of the things that has definitely come out of this is the much wider use of digital and telephone services. But that digital exclusion of the most vulnerable has been really highlighted. And we must prioritise that going forward in order to improve resilience and give people the ability to catch up and to have a chance. It demonstrates that there is a need to have a new sustainable model of investment in the voluntary sector, and that we need to commission and deliver services on a much wider footprint in order to build back that resilience into our population. We're all coping and interpreting this next phase of living with the COVID pandemic, and voluntary sector organisations have a really important role in trying to spread those health messages, at the same time supporting people to get back into some sort of everyday living and well-being. The immediacy of the health of the crisis is developing into a long-term relationship. Today's event gives us an opportunity to hear, discuss about resilient communities and what we need to make them even more sustainable. We do have some very fantastic speakers, and I'm going to shut up now and pass over to the first one, who is Cormac Russell, Managing Director of Nurture Development, who believes in community-driven change. Cormac, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Hilary. Now, let's just hope that our technology is kind to us here. Can you all see this? You can see the slide. Wonderful. Let me just go into it then, and I'll trust that you'll holler if there's anything not clear. So thank you for creating some space really for us to reflect together. I think the sentiment we gather around is one of solidarity and one of searching, as well as we figure out how to move into a more pandemic conscious future. Because I think whether it's pandemics or it's heat waves or excess winter deaths, the reality is, in terms of questioning what we mean by resilience, it's fair to say that challenges are going to exist out ahead. The last 20 weeks, depending on which jurisdiction you found yourself in, we work in about 35 countries around the world, so we've been quite close up to the work in Singapore over the last 20 weeks or so. Has really been striking, not just in terms of public health, but also in terms of economic injustice, and of course the police killing of George Floyd has also brought home some very, very serious deficits really in how our institutions function, and the issue of institutional racism, which is not just peculiar to the USA. So it's been an incredibly intense time, And I wanted to reflect together about how resilience as a lens may be useful in this regard. In thinking about resilience, I think one of the cautions that I have, or one of my anxieties around using the term is that I think it's open to abuse, or at least to misinterpretation. When I think of resilience, I think of, for example, the built-in resilience that a forest has after a bushfire or a natural fire to recover. In ecological terms, they call it succession, where the plants that begin to re-emerge are the ones where essentially they're seeded from the soil that's already there and has survived. And I suppose in a sense, I like that idea of resilience, that idea that we will use what we have to secure what we need to move forward, to prevail. I think that's a really positive and important message. But as I think about the challenges of public health and the challenges of economic injustice and the challenges of structural racism, it strikes me that George Floyd's words are poignant across all three challenges. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. So to my mind, whether we're in the public sector in this call, or we're in the third sector, or we're thinking about ourselves as people who live in neighborhoods, the question before us is what are we going to do to show up in the lives of the people we care about and we love and we serve in a way that means, as guests in their lives, to use Rob's lovely turn of phrase, that they're more likely, as a consequence of us being in their lives, to say, I can breathe free. You see, to my mind, one of the great problems with an awful lot of these discussions is they nearly always get pulled back to services and programs and money, as opposed to social justice and social change. And I think one of the reasons why the work over the last 10 years, particularly in the UK, for me, has been so nourishing is that where we've learned most about social justice is at the feet of citizens, at the feet of local people living in real communities across the UK as well as across the world, who are teaching us again and again that when institutional capacities reach the necessary limits of what they can do, it's often when we see the revelation of this incredible reservoir of resource and potential in our communities. And I think it's important to recognize that that didn't just come in the shape of volunteering. It came in the shape of citizenship. It came in the shape of neighborliness. It came in the shape of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in their own lives and in the lives of their neighbors, many of whom would not necessarily think of what they were doing as volunteering or in any way as a big deal, but they did it nevertheless. And I think that has had a very, very significant impact. And it's great to see the likes of the Lancet beginning to acknowledge the importance of community participation and recognizing that volunteering, while crucial, is just a subset of community engagement, and how people participate across the UK and across the world is bigger than just volunteering. It's bigger than how we classically understand what it is people do when they try to make change happen in their lives or the lives of their neighbors. And somehow it's more ordinary as well. It's a kind of it's a little bit of a conundrum. I wanted to share some stories as I reflect with you into what we mean when we talk about resilience of ordinary people living in neighborhoods or living in villages. And I think it's helpful for us as we think into a pandemic conscious future, because I'm not sure a post-COVID future is necessarily a useful framing. I think one of the things that we could imagine creatively into is the idea that we change how we understand the units of change. And we stop imagining that change is about behavior change in individuals, and we stop imagining that change is simply about our institutions doing a better job or our politicians reforming how they show up, and start as well to imagine that the neighborhood, that the small bounded place is actually a potent unit of change. We're learning in all kinds of ways, actually, that when institutions in the third sector and in the public sector start thinking about themselves as precipitators of change in neighborhoods and in villages, and not just as providers of services, that all kinds of things are possible. For example, in Voorstad, which is in Deventer in the Netherlands, there was an issue in the neighborhood which was around race relations. A Syrian family had essentially been victims of hate crime in the neighborhood of Voorstad. But what was interesting was that the third sector organizations and the public sector organizations said, if we're going to resolve this issue, as well as creating an alternative placement or home for the family away from the issue of racism, we need to figure out how we're going to have a conversation with the people who live in the neighborhood of Voorstad, which changes the experience for people who are experiencing racism, but also begins a new conversation with people who are behaving in a racist manner. So they began to reach out, the professionals who were serving this neighborhood began to reach out to the local associations in the neighborhood. You see in the image there two associations. One is the football club, so you can see some folks sitting in the stadium cheering on their team, the Eagles, local football club there. But also you see the Knit and Natter group. And it's interesting to think that a professional would think to reach out to the local football club and also the Knit and Natter group and other associations in the neighborhood and say, could we have a conversation about what you want to do to create places of welcome within your community, especially for those most vulnerable to having their gifts not seen or received and most susceptible to race crime. And these communities stepped up in all kinds of, I think, remarkable ways that I don't think could come out of an institution. One of the things that the Knit and Natter group said they'd like to do with the football club was to actually knit a 3-kilometre scarf that they wrapped around the community, making a very clear, demonstrable statement that this is a neighbourhood which has a place of welcome for the stranger and can actually welcome in people from all parts of the planet. They also wanted to reach out to the family. The Knit and Natter group actually wanted to have a conversation with a Syrian family that had essentially left out of fear and fled the neighborhood. And in the process of having the conversation with the family about what would need to happen for the family to return, they knit a scarf that wrapped around the house of the family. Again, a public demonstration that they stood in solidarity with the family. An expression or a word that's used in the Netherlands is gezellig, which translates as cozy or a place of welcome. So there's nothing as cozy as a scarf, but having one wrapped around your house and having neighbours stand in solidarity and saying, we stand shoulder to shoulder with you and we will figure out together how we create a place of welcome, I think creates an interesting and a different sense of what we mean by resilience. You see, resilience is where the seeds of welcome can blossom even against the challenges, not in spite of them, but actually because of them. It's interesting that in the conversations that were had with folks who are actually being racist in their behaviours, what these local people were able to do was get past ideology and get into biography, and actually discover that many of the behaviours that people were manifesting, which were unacceptable, were behaviours that they had received rather than they believed. And beginning to open up a new culture of possibilities where people are resilient. And the resilience is measured not by the strength of the leadership or by silly childlike narratives about we're in war against racism or we're in war against COVID, because we're not at war. And instead being the adults in the room that says a resilient community is a community that can have difficult conversations and can make change happen in a way that includes those we actually find objectionable. And we can bring their voice in too and create real change at the cultural level. I think what they were doing, and I think what we mean by resilience, is they were surfacing the seeds that exist within their community, the resources or the assets. I love this slide that NDTI often share, which shows that in every community there are invisible resources we call them assets, but resources is probably more of a vernacular term, which I think are at the heart of what we need to begin to grow, not just a response to pandemics, but a response to economic challenges that lie ahead. And I don't think these are economic challenges specific to this moment in time. The invidious choices that people are making between their lives and their livelihoods at the moment are choices that many people have had to make for decades, and that many others will have to make for decades to come. So how do we do something about surfacing the assets and the resources within local communities that create local economies where people have an economic floor, as well as figuring out how we advance narratives and important discussions about, for example, universal citizen income? I think one of the ways of certainly doing it is beginning the conversation where people live their lives, and beginning to figure out what is it that exists at local neighborhood level that people can discover, connect, and mobilize. And I think regardless of the challenges we're facing, regardless of the issues that we will face, in every community, there are an abundance of the 6 resources or the assets you see listed here. I don't have time to list them all, but you can review them yourselves. So I think the challenge in terms of creating and nurturing abundant and resilient communities is enabling people to make visible the invisible. Because this is the great irony. Most of these assets are not visible. In a sense, most of what people do to be healthy, for example, they're doing while not thinking, I'm doing this to be healthy. So in all kinds of ways, just as we saw over the last 20 weeks or so, less for some people, what I think we're beginning to recognize is there's a reservoir of competency and capacity in communities that isn't visible to the untrained eye. But at certain times, certain precipitants make the invisible visible. And in a sense, that's what COVID did. It immediately revealed the limits of the institutional world, and at the same time, it revealed the capacities of the non-institutional civic space. And it also helped us see what was the sweet spot that joined those two spaces together. We saw that through volunteering. We saw it through citizenship. We saw it through service. We saw it through, again, expressions of vocational contribution, not just professionalism, but vocational contribution, where people made sacrifices of immense emotional toll to themselves and their families. But we also saw it at the neighborhood level. And often it's at the neighborhood level because it doesn't have the glass of the expert or the glass of the institution or the resource of the formal organization that we miss the fact that there is an incredible recipe in every neighborhood just waiting to be mixed into the right combination. One of the things that I think has been clear over the last number of weeks is that communities at local level have been taking on functions. How many of us on this call have struggled to take on the function of teaching our own at home, of being the wisdom, the primary educators of our children? Not easy to do when you're trying to work or deal with the anxiety of being in lockdown, but somehow we cobbled it together and managed. We took on the function of educating, of raising our children and teaching them. But also we saw people enabling health. In my own community, we have enabled a number of people who, for various reasons, wanted to end their end-of-life experience at home and die at home. And practicing physical distancing, we've been able, with the support of just some awesome people within the hospice who largely precipitated our efforts to be alongside our neighbours as they ended their life as they would have wished, at homes and with dignity. We've also seen in our neighbourhoods and in neighbourhoods around the world how being really around and connected to our neighbourhood has produced security and a sense of safety at a time of great anxiety. We've seen people think much more about their ecologies, their local places. I'm seeing neighbourhood beautification schemes like never before in neighbourhoods, spawning, I think, from the fact that we spent so much time at home and actually so much time in our built environments. We're also seeing people think very creatively about their local economies about food sovereignty, and about what it actually means to raise our children again. I think one of the things we've also seen people take an active function around is care, is figuring out how we can be there for our neighbours and how we can care for each other, not as a programme or as a service, but as a freely given gift of the heart, one person to another, near neighbours, not salaried strangers. Now, why are all these functions so important? And why, if, for example, going forward, we were to find a positive precipitant to them? Because in a sense, COVID-19 is a negative precipitant to all of these functions. But I think the third sector is a positive precipitant. I think clever public sector supports, good foundation supports, are positive precipitants. Why would we want to have more precipitation of citizen-led action and not just the provision of stock services? What might be the evidence to say this is a good idea? Well, the evidence is that we would want to do that because it leads to better outcomes. In terms of economics, and we're facing tough times ahead in terms of economies, those with deep social networks at the local level are 4 times more likely to get a job than those who simply and solely have support from a job centre. Now, it doesn't mean that having both isn't desirable. In fact, I would argue it is. But we shouldn't have one at the expense of another. It's about how do we combine those two supports. Many of you I know will be familiar with the work of the town in Frome, but it's fascinating to compare the impact in terms of the reduction in demand of services, GP and hospital services in Frome, which is in the county of Somerset, went down by 17%, at the same time as we were seeing a 29% increase across the county. So what was going on there? Well, in both instances, what we're seeing is that we are investing in the precipitation of neighbour-to-neighbour connection and enabling them not just to be connected with each other and have nice activities, but be productive, be creative, take on functions that make a difference. So it's not just about, you know, it's a nice thing to do, or befriending schemes, or feeding, or getting prescriptions, but it's a whole range of other things as well as. And this is why I want to call our attention not just to relief action. You know, it's not just about responding to crisis. Resilient communities are focused on community renewal. And so in a way, you could say that for a long time, the reason that perhaps communities didn't recognize their own resilience and their own capacity for renewal is that so many of the 7 functions that I'd mentioned and the 6 assets that I'd mentioned were kind of outsourced to the institutional world. And you know, so much of this stuff is done to us. Our health is done to us. Our education is done for us. Maybe sometimes with us if we're lucky. But what we've seen in the last 20 weeks are so many things that were actually led by and done by citizens, done and led by volunteers, almost because the need demanded it so. But what might be possible if we thought about that into the future, not just as an emergency response, but as the way resilience communities show up? Why? Because that's our culture. It's not just about random acts of kindness, it's about rooted acts of kindness in our culture. This is our way of doing things around here. See, it's almost like a Russian doll, isn't it? Where at the heart of a democracy is a citizen connected in association with other citizens. The difficulty is that we're living through a time when there's an inversion in democracy, when so many people think that the role of the professional is primary, that, you know, in a sense, the role of the citizen is defined as that which happens after the important work of the professional is done. What we've learned over the last few weeks is that actually in a democracy, it's the other way around. The role of the professional is defined as that which happens after the important work of citizens is done. Because in so many ways, the frontline first responders in COVID-19, as we see the emergence of new spikes, when it comes to the economic challenges of our future, when it comes to social justice, are us in our neighbourhoods, citizen to citizen, the primary responders. In a sense, what I'm calling your attention to is a kind of a shift in focus that starts with this idea that citizenship is the primary and first course of response. And in a sense, the neighbourhood is the primary unit of change. Seeing citizens as producers and then figuring out how, as they're in the front or in the driving seat, we can be supporters in the back seat. One of the challenges, I think, to community resilience is community degradation, where outside agencies are coming in and taking over and doing to and for. We all know Lao Tzu's great saying, you know, that of the great leader, they will say when he is gone, we did it ourselves. So this is a little play on that. Where community degradation and resilience is harmed, the sentiment is, let's go to the people with an agenda, find out what is wrong with them, tell them what to do, enable and fix them, start with what they don't have, boast about what we do have, tell them what they should think, and then they will say, when we are gone, of the worst leaders, what have they done to us? What have they done to us? Resilience isn't about communities saying, boy, we got a great service. Resilience is about communities saying, I think, we know what it is we can do best and we do it. We know where we need help and we get it. And we also know what we need outside agencies to do for us, and they do it in a transparent, equitable and democratic way. And that's why our resilience isn't harmed, but it's enhanced with services there in supplement of our resilience, not as a replacement to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cormac. That was very, very thought-provoking, and there's an awful lot of comments in the chat box. I don't see any actual questions, so I'm just going to kick off with one question because we're quite tight for time. You talked about we needed to have behaviour change. Who should be leading that behaviour change?
I personally, I think we need to shift it to culture change. I suppose what I was saying is I think behaviour change is too narrow a framing. I think one of the reasons that in a lot of jurisdictions where we've seen public health being hijacked politically is because public health, unfortunately, became narrowly defined as about behaviour change. I think where public health was strongest, it was able to frame it within the context of population health and culture change. And so I think it's about saying, it's about changing the narrative. And I think it's about saying in a humble way that there are those last three questions, which I guess is a little bit about behavior change around leadership. And it's kind of saying, how do we change our behavior from thinking we're the hosts with all of the answers and solutions in the institutional world, and instead thinking of ourselves as guests, in the first instance, leaders as conveners, saying, how do we convene communities and really show deep regard and respect for what they've achieved over the last few years, and then ask, or the last few weeks, and ask, how can we be of service to them and stand in solidarity with them? You know, and I suppose in a sense that's behavioral. But it feels to me like the real question at the heart of what we're trying to figure out is, how do we enable culture change within our organizations and within our communities and go beyond individualized behavior change narratives like, you know, smoking cessation or whatever. Public health has proven to be incredibly important, and it's more important than just behavior change.
Thank you for that. And something else that came up in the chat box was, how do we stop going backwards into our old ways as we sort of move into this next phase? How do we stop ourselves going backwards?
Well, I think one of the challenges will be, it's really interesting to see how there's kind of a move back, it seems to me, again, where institutions, having seen the capacity of communities, are some, not all, are kind of moving back into quite an imperial set of behaviors. So some of this is about relocating authority and not just responsibility and money. So I wonder if one of the ways is about making sure that the people who've been defined as the problem secure the power to redefine the problem. If we could actually take not just responsibility, but also some resource and some authority and really start relocating it into the hands of local people and communities in a better way. So for me, it's about investing more in community building at the neighborhood level and less in programmatic intervention. And just one other add-on, I'd also say that I would feel if we shifted our measure of success, our baseline, and instead of measuring the number of people who come into our programs, we measured the extent to which people are interdependent in natural communities, I think we'd probably find that we could avoid slipping back into more imperial top-down ways of working.
That's really encouraging. It's about measuring the right thing, isn't it, rather than the wrong thing that doesn't actually change the outcome. I love your analogy of the seeds of welcome and about being guests. And I think you've been an excellent first guest for us. I haven't got any questions coming up, so as we're quite tight on time, I think if you're happy, we will move on to Professor Donna Hall, and then maybe we can catch up on any further questions towards the end of the session. So thank you.
Good. Thanks.
I'm going to hand over now to Professor Donna Hall, who is going to talk about foundations for building sustainable communities. And in the little biography, it said that she's a public service pioneer, passionate about person-centred public services and communities. And I think that leads on nicely from what Cormac was saying. It is all very, very much about the person. So over to you, Donna.
That's great. Thanks, Hilary. Hope you can hear me okay. So thanks. I really enjoyed listening to Cormac's speech. I've never actually heard him speak before. It was really inspirational. Thank you. And I think there is a strong link between what Cormac's described around the neighbourhood versus the salaried stranger. And what we tried to do in Wigan, and again, I'm not here to say everything was perfect, everything was wonderful, and we just woke up one day with this great idea. It wasn't like that at all. And basically, we started with a massive budget problem. A massive crisis was the kind of precipitator for some of this stuff. So 160 million we had to find in savings, because we were number 3 on the list of most cut councils in the whole of the UK, based on austerity, and deprivation is a big factor in Wigan. So we were having to take all that money out, and at the same time trying to protect critical services for 323,000 people. We realised we didn't have any money, but we had 323,000 people, and tried to tap into the assets within our neighbourhoods, within our staff. We also, just slightly disagreeing with the salaried stranger point from Cormac, 89% of public servants lived in Wigan Borough, lived in the neighbourhoods that we were trying to work differently with the residents. They were the community. They weren't just separate from the community, they were part of it. So we really tried to tap into them as neighbours, as citizens working differently with their other neighbours in the place. We did an experiment back in 2010-11 called the Life Project with Hilary Cottam. I don't know if people have read Hilary's latest book, Radical Help, but it does link across to some of the work that Cormac's described and some of the work we did in Wigan. And we basically worked with families whose children were on the edge of care over a period of a year. And we learned a lot from that project about relationships and public servants working differently, building different relationships with people that they were trying to support. We found some horrific outcomes from that work. We were spending 80% of our time assessing families and then referring them on to other bits of the system without actually trying to help them. It was costing upwards of $250,000 a year per family, but it wasn't helping anybody. And all the social workers, drug and alcohol workers, housing officers who were involved in doing that repeatedly over the years with generation after generation of families very often, found that we weren't actually helping them. So we reversed that to try to make the way that we operated in the Life Project, the way that we worked, as Cormac's described, every day, all the time, building on the assets in communities, building on the strengths in the family, the strengths of individuals, and trying to take off the lanyards, get away from the clipboard and build a different relationship as public servants, as professionals, as neighbours, as communities working together differently. We also did a piece of work in a different part of Wigan called Scholes with Nesta, a Creative Councils project. And again, some very similar learning from that, this time working with older people on social care and finding out that our institutions weren't working, they weren't helping them. Day centres where people were being shipped around in a minibus and sat with people that they didn't know, didn't particularly have anything in common with. Again, expensive and just awful outcomes. So the learning from those two things, plus the fact that we had no money, made us realise back in 2010 that we had to do something completely different and redefine the role of public services in the place. So not trying to do things to communities, but very much trying to listen, trying to use ethnography and anthropology. And we actually employed an anthropologist to come and help us to redesign the way that we engaged with residents and citizens and built strong bonds of neighbourliness between them and the public. So it wasn't perfect. It wasn't just dreamt up. It was iterative, and it's still going on. It wasn't about any kind of political or managerial imperial leader. It was around a different culture for place, a different role for public services, working differently, building on assets in the place. So I won't run through all the achievements because they do speak for themselves. The one that I think is quite remarkable, given the funding that we had to take out, and again, public health, completely agree with Cormac, isn't just about behaviour change, it's about deep systemic change. And the thing that I was personally really pleased at when I saw it was the healthy life expectancy figures. So in parts of Wigan, we managed to, in the most deprived areas, we managed to increase healthy life expectancy. So that's years of life with good health by 7 years, which was because we invested in neighbourhood projects and local community projects. It wasn't commissioned in the usual top-down way. It was very much asking people what did they want, what did they need in their neighbourhood to make things work better for them. So we made all the savings. We did loads with our workforce and radically transformed the relationship and the way we worked. So again, I won't spend much time on this because I think Cormac's covered it, but we tried to apply some of Cormac's thinking, Hilary's thinking, and the Nesta work from a very traditional approach of transactional approach, doing things to people, with individual service specifications and contracts that don't reflect the way that people live their lives, to a completely different way, focusing on outcomes in the place, trying to build strengths-based programs into neighbourhoods that were based on what people said they wanted, and are constantly listening. So systemic listening is quite hard to get. A big foundation trust in a place to listen in a different way. In some places, a foundation trust could be a hermetically sealed organism, some operating anywhere. It could be on the moon. But what we tried to do was get a different connection with all of the organisations: NHS, housing, mental health support services, social care, the police, everybody working differently with our residents. So if we can move on to the next one. So one of the key things that we did was to try to build on some of the principles of neighbourliness and neighbourhoods into the way that we delivered services alongside and with residents. So the NHS 10-year plan says that populations of between 30 to 50,000 are so it's bigger than neighbourhood, but they are ideally placed to develop integrated care and support systems. And we did this over a period of around 5 years altogether, and they're still going on now. So all the agencies working in the place, police, housing, drug and alcohol services, everyone agreed that they would change the way that they operated and work around a different geography, so that we were quite simple, really. We could get public servants working in the same room. I know it sounds a really basic thing, but they weren't sharing. They weren't sharing different ways of working with each other. They weren't sharing intelligence about individuals and families and communities. So we were all separately interacting, doing our own little bit, looking after our own key performance indicator, but not working in a whole system way with families. So one of the things we used as well, which sounds quite technical, and I don't know whether you use it in West Yorkshire, is something called risk stratification, which is basically you identify by looking at all the information you've got in your systems. key number of individuals and families, and you intensively provide support by encouraging local community and voluntary sector organisations mainly to work differently with those families and get them to feel like they have got that support infrastructure around them. Because some people, you know, really struggle to be part of a neighbourhood. There may have been neighbour disputes. There may have been, you know, things going on over the years that have meant that people feel quite excluded, even when they're part of a neighbourhood. So doing some of the things Cormac described around the Syrian family, we tried to do that intensively through people's GPs, where we felt there was a trusted relationship usually, or through schools when it was around children and young people, and had remarkable results. So we worked out there were around 4,000 people who were at risk of an unplanned hospital admission for whatever reason. We thought initially that they would fall into the older end of the age group, but they didn't. A lot of them were in their 40s and 50s with underlying mental health issues, but not kind of bad enough to access any kind of service or support. Very often isolated, not connected into community activity, and not deemed bad enough to get mental health support, which is terrible. So they were being told, go away, get worse, come back when you're worse, and then we'll maybe find you an appointment in another 6 months. So, you know, that's just not the way. And of course, they did go away and get worse, because that's just the way that we process people through our broken systems. So we tried to turn that on its head, and with remarkable results. So within a year, there was within the group that we were working intensively with community and voluntary groups, GPs and schools, we found a 30% reduction in unplanned hospital admissions in that group. That wasn't the outcome we were really interested in, though. It was healthy life expectancy and improvement in social connection. So just moving on to the deal, this is what it is in a very simple, simply described way. It was a social contract, a different relationship between citizen and state. One of the things we did was we froze council tax, general fund element of council tax over an 8-year period, so that it equated to around £550 per person, per household, per year. It's quite a lot of money. And we felt, particularly for people on a fixed income, that was a really important part of our side of the deal. So we managed to make the savings by closing down some of the institutional things that we had in place that weren't working, and, you know, trying to encourage our staff to think differently and work differently with residents and build a different bond so that they were no longer salaried strangers. We can move on to the next one. We applied the deal across the board to other aspects of what we did as well. So we found that there was a large number of private sector care providers who had 15-minute appointments, who were probably sometimes the only person that somebody would see in a day for 15 minutes. And we found that the profit margins were really tight in those businesses, and, you know, individuals, the people working for those companies didn't feel they were connecting with the people that they were going in to see and trying to support. So we developed an ethical home care framework, which built on some of the principles of asset-based working, and all of the contracts that were let were based on asset-based thinking, and tried to embed that into our provider market, which meant that we were the 5th most improved, it's on the slide later on, care provider in the UK, in Wigan. We can move on. So there were 6 really simple principles of the deal. The first 3 are there. It was about different conversations. So rather than trying to fix people, seeing people as a unit of need that needs to be intervened, to be resolved, we tried to think about the professional as a partner in a different relationship and a different conversation with the resident. Knowledge of the community, we felt that there was a lot of fractured knowledge about local communities. So GPs in the olden days, when I started in working with communities in Liverpool in 1985, the local GP knew the local community. They were, the local school knew the local community and knew the GP. But those bonds of connection within a place, because of the kind of way that we measure and manage ourselves around Ofsted, CQC, KPIs, very often those neighbourhood bonds have gone. So we were trying to build that up again within all the assets that we had in the place. Integrated place-based teams, I've already described those. We'll move on to the next one. Again, building on asset-based, all the assets in a community. One of the assets that we had in a place called Plattbridge in Wigan was the local McDonald's, and people would think, well, from a public health point of view, that's a disaster. That cannot be an asset, but it actually was. That the franchisee from the McDonald's was one of our ex-care leavers and wanted to work differently with young people and had a passion for organising youth sport activities in the local area. So we worked differently with him. Some of the young people who were in McDonald's for the free Wi-Fi, we kind of captured their imagination about what they wanted in the place in Plattbridge and worked to create a youth group that they then ran and managed themselves. But you know, at places, every organisation has assets. You just sometimes have to look harder in some places for them. But local residents told us that the McDonald's was an asset for them. The attitude and behaviour of our staff was really key. So we used anthropology to try to get people to develop a blank mind when they were working with people, rather than just assume they have all the answers, to actively listen in a different way. And we did a lot around workforce training and development, and developed something called the Be Wigan experience, which was every single member of staff from the hospital, every GP, everybody who worked in a school, or the police working in the place went on this Be Wigan experience, which was to try to get people to adopt values and behaviours that were around social connection rather than trying to fix people. And finally, it was, I think the most important thing was around giving the integrated place-based teams the permission to innovate, to just think differently about each neighbourhood, all very different neighbourhoods, and each one, you know, trying to build up the capacity within that neighbourhood, but give staff the budgets and the freedom to do things differently. If we move on to the next one. Ethical home care, again, I don't think I've got time to go through this one, but it was home care, I think, is one of the things that the pandemic has thrown into sharp focus. We've got a lot of work to do in trying to reform social care, and particularly, you know, private sector care homes that have been really hit hard by COVID. They weren't seen as a connected part of the system, and that's our fault, I think, and we need to resolve that. They need to be seen as part of the neighbourhood. So we did a lot of work with our private care home market, and it did really reap rich rewards. Yeah, so sorry, it's the third most improved in the country over the last 12 months. And we used asset-based commissioning as part of the care home reform programme. So 88% of care homes in Wigan are either good or outstanding, and with really good figures around delayed transfers of care, which is a real problem at the moment. We can move on. So again, a lot of it was around not a top-down commissioning model through the CCG, but it was around thinking and working differently within those 7 neighbourhood teams and working out what people actually wanted, what local GPs found were gaps in local neighbourhoods. We put altogether 13 million into community and voluntary sector initiatives and ideas that came from the community and voluntary sector, not what we thought as public servants people wanted, is what they thought was important. Like the Froome example, we found a massive reduction in demand for services as a result of building up the community infrastructure. So we had 500 projects funded through the 13 million, all very different. But the most important thing, I think, was that we started them with a different philosophy, that it wasn't about monitoring them and kind of strangling all the innovation within them constantly, but it was about a relationship based on trust, so that you've told us this is important, here's the money, just do it and come back to us and tell us how it's gone. Some things will work, some things won't work, but we've got to try it. We've got to change the relationship with the community and voluntary sector to one of mutual respect, from one of micromanagement. So, you know, hospitals overspend all the time. I chair one, and overspends happen all the time, and we just get off the hook. We just get more money given to us. When a community and voluntary sector overspend, then, you know, they never get a penny again in the future. You know, we're talking about multi-million-pound contracts versus a £10,000 grant for a mental health project. So we've got to treat, you know, both of those scenarios with the same kind of level of trust, honesty, and openness. So integrated care systems, I don't need to tell you the case for doing that. You're already doing it. I think the work that you're doing in West Yorkshire and Harrogate, I've said it to Rob on many occasions, is the best in the country at the moment. It really is. And I think people could learn a lot from the way that you're working differently with residents and in neighbourhoods. Move on to I think it's the last one, no, second to last one. So these are the service lines. And I know, Cormac's mentioned before, it's not about services, but I think the trick we've got to pull off is combining some of Cormac's thinking with existing services. I think it can be done. I think there is a way of doing it. So previously, this is what we had in Wigan, and we changed it down to one base very much around neighbourhood demand and need, rather than all of these different things for adult social care, separately interacting with people. I remember when my mum was discharged from hospital, on the day she came home, 22 different bits of the NHS and social care came to see her at home on that day, all in the wrong order. None of them connected with her, none of them asked her about family, friends, neighbours. It was all about Mary with a broken hip. It wasn't about Mary as a person. And, we know that we don't respond well to that as consumers, as citizens, as neighbours. We don't want to be interacting with like that. But, the system says that's what we have to do. So just move on to the next one. So the design principles are here, very much based on co-location, sharing of resources, embedding the asset-based work into the way that we redesigned everything, multi-skilling of people, so that people could do more than one thing, that they could connect differently, that we could use the risk stratification in those neighbourhoods, and that we could build on some of the assets that we had in primary care and around people's personalised plans. Move on to the next one. So benefits are massive. Benefits to the patient, the person, benefits to primary care, and benefits to secondary care as well. So from my point of view, it's just a win-win all the way around. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Donna. Very good for timing. That's brilliant. There's lots of comments in the chat, and I think there's going to be a surge on McDonald's, because I think people love the idea that they can go and sit in McDonald's and get messages across and actually get to the right people. There's a couple of challenges in the chat. How did you celebrate the change in the way that the staff are working and the staff attitudes? That's one question. And linked to that, to me, is was there a change in risk appetite?
Okay, I think the way we celebrated it was, we did the usual kind of reward and recognition stuff with staff. I think the main thing that people liked from speaking to them and listening to them was that ability to just do what they always knew they should be doing in a community, in their teams, and we'd stopped them. We'd tied them up in red tape and bureaucracy in the past. But again, some of the learning, if you do read Hilary's book, and if you do read the end of every chapter, it says, this is the most soul-destroying bit of Radical Health. It says, this project was really successful, but the commissioners decided not to recommission it. So, what we were trying to do was make it just the way we work, learning from experiments like that, constantly saying thank you to staff for what they do, seeing staff not only as, as staff, as assets for the organisation, but seeing them as assets for the community. Everyone had paid time to go and volunteer in the local neighbourhood, in the local community. They were given paid time to do that. Started off as 2 days a week, and then we increased it to a week. But what we found was that people made that connection with the community group and stuck with it. So it wasn't about, award ceremonies, although we did that. It was more around that regular listening to them and responding when we got things wrong. Going back to risk appetite, yeah, we tried things that went wrong. So one of them was of the 500 projects. I remember having this debate in the council meeting, and some of the councillors said, you can't just give them the money, they'll run away with it. You can't trust the community and voluntary sector because, they're untrustworthy and they'll You know, they won't spend it on the right things. And of the 500, only 2 did that. You know, only 2 ran away. I think one bought a van and went to Spain with the money, and the other bought a dodgy church building with no planning permission. But you know, the rest of them were brilliant, and I think we got more back because of the trust that we built with the sector. We got so much more back, and the community, more importantly, got more back. So yeah, risk appetite, definitely. And what we said, you know, we had 3 core values in Be Wigan. One was be courageous, recognising that sometimes we've got to try things and they won't work, but we will always back you. We'll always back staff to try new things, and communities.
Thank you, Donna. That is all about trust, and it often is reaping much bigger rewards than you first throw at it, isn't it? I'd like to bring Mel Pickup. She wants to ask a question.
Hi.
Hiya, Mel.
Hi, Donna. Nice to see you. I'm sorry, I could only just join, and I just joined in time to see your presentation. So I'm really interested in how I think what COVID has taught us actually is that if you get the messaging and the relationship right around some really important things with the communities, pretty fundamentally, like stay at home and do social distancing in that sort of specific example, you get the right outcome and the right benefits. So when we talk as places about communication with our places and our populations, I always kind of think of it almost as a continuum that starts with communication, which implies a bit of passivity, and then moves into engagement, but then into activation, community activation. And I'm really interested in community activation and that sort of resilience bit within the community. But the question specifically is, how do you identify the people who have the ability to lead members within their own communities? And how do you nurture them to really get the benefits out of those relationships and networks?
Yeah, I think a lot of the time they are just getting on with stuff in their local area, and you know, they wouldn't ever be part of a council for voluntary services. They would never stand to be an elected councillor in those localities. They're just getting on with it. And I know it sounds awful to say it, and I don't want to gender it, but a lot of women do this stuff, and a lot of men as well. But a lot of women, very you know, determined women, and who have, against all the odds, just love their community and love their neighbourhood. There's one woman in particular I can think of in Wigan called Barbara Nettleton, who ran a community centre, which we just, honestly, the way we interacted with Barbara was awful, up until we developed the deal. She was sick of us, sick to the back teeth of us, because we just, when we had money, when we had single regeneration budget or urban programme, we would give her some money for a project, but then as soon as the money had run out, we'd go away again. So it wasn't about a relationship. It wasn't two-way. We didn't listen to her at all. It was whenever we needed her, we would wheel her out for things. So she got pissed off, to be honest. I'm not allowed to swear, but she did. And, you know, so she said, just please stick with this deal. It's about the relationship is more important than the money, the listening to us. So she would, you know, it was like a constant stream of intelligence and information, and it was like having a litmus test with people like Barbara. And there are so many Barbaras out there, Barbaras and Bobs, who, if you don't work with them in that different way, you're missing such an important part of the social fabric. So you ignore people like that at your peril. So I think they are out there. Very often they're known, very often they're operating below the radar, but they are known within communities, I think, Mel. It's just about making sure that they get the recognition they deserve.
Thank you for that, Donna. We've got one quick question from Simon. If you'd like to come in, and then we'll call that the last question for Donna now, please.
Thanks, Hilary. Really great presentation, Donna. Great to hear all the work you're doing. Just one quick question. Absolutely understand about how it can be difficult to reach those people in communities that have a great voice and identifying them, and it's key to get in hold of them. How do you do that with BAME communities? I was just keen to hear.
Yeah, we were having this discussion last night, actually, at our Board of Governors for the Foundation Trust. I mean, we're really lucky in Bolton. We've got more BAME governors than we have non-BAME governors, and they are incredibly, brilliantly supportive of, of our organisation. But they are also really active in their local communities. And, I think it's not just about going to the usual. People say, well, we did a presentation at the mosque, or we did something in a temple. I think it's about all organisations finding those kind of social entrepreneurs and supporting them. Very often they've got fantastic ideas but no backup with either resources or premises or money. So I think it's about using all the social networks in the place. That's why, I don't like the term social prescribing, I'll be honest. I've got a problem with it because I think it implies a power relationship between a GP and a person, as if they know best and they're prescribing. But I often think there are lots of social networks that develop around GP practices and schools. And for me, GP practices and schools in the neighbourhood are the key gravitational pull and gravitational point that you find a lot of spin-off things happening. So I think using those assets to identify and asking people you're going into a school and asking a teaching assistant, who are the people making things happen in this neighbourhood? Neighbourhoods know who they are. We don't always know, but they know.
Thank you very much, Donna. That's rounded up really nicely. It's about people, it's about relationships, and it's about letting those people talk and listening to those people to build up that trust. We now have what is called a comfort break, or what I have seen written as a fluid balancing session. So we are closing down. Well, we're not closing down, but we are having a 5-minute break, and we will be back at 1:45, please. everybody. That was very quick 5 minutes, I know. We've now got 3 very interesting guest speakers, and they've only got 10 minutes each, so I'm going to have to wave my watch at them. Hopefully they'll see it from the screen. First of all, we've got Kim Ledbetter, an ambassador for the Joe Cox Foundation, and one of the most enthusiastic and people with the most tireless energy you'll ever come across. So I'm sure Kim's going to be very rousing. We've then got Heather Nelson, Chief Executive of Black Health Initiatives, who's a champion for inclusion and lived experience. And I think that's a real good challenge for us, and an add-on to this conversation, that we must think about lived experience and really use it. And then finally, we have Vicky Beer, who is CEO for Project 6, who's got a real interest in complex needs. And again, challenging health inequalities and getting rid of the hideous inequalities that there are out there. So we've got 10 minutes each, ladies, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. Over to Kim.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Hilary. Yeah, wow, what a fantastic event. I'm so enthused by what I've heard so far. I started with a sheet. I haven't done a very formal presentation, but I started with a sheet with notes, and it looked reasonably legible. And then as Cormac was speaking, I filled it up with lots more notes. And then as Donna was speaking, I filled it up with lots more notes, because I cannot make head nor tail of it. So I'm going to do my best. Yeah, as Hilary said, my name's Kim Ledbetter. I work as an ambassador for the Joe Cox Foundation at a national level, and I work locally as chair of More in Common Batley and Spen on a voluntary level in West Yorkshire here. And the reason I do both of those things, for anybody that doesn't know, is because Joe Cox was my sister, and Joe was the MP for Batley and Spen, who was murdered in June 2016. And, you know, as I always say when I speak, I still can't believe what's happened to our lives. I can't believe what happened to Joe. But what I've tried to do since that day is to channel my energy into creating as much positive action as possible from the most horrific of circumstances. So thank you very much to Rob and Karen for inviting me to be part of this fantastic event today. It's always a pleasure to work with them. I adore them both. And it's great that there's so many people joining the call today on this fabulous Friday. My background prior to Joe's murder was actually in health-related exercise and fitness, and a very holistic approach to physical activity and health and well-being. And I sort of specialised a little bit in behaviour change. So I used to think about how we could get people to be more active and adopt healthy behaviours. And now I think about how we can get people to connect within communities more, but some very similar principles there. I taught at Bradford College and at Dewsbury College, so I worked in the public sector. Prior to that, I worked in the private sector. And then as a result of Joe's death, I ended up in the voluntary sector. So one of the things I feel really passionately about, which has been alluded to already, is the ability of sectors to work together. And I think that is really, really important in creating deep and meaningful change. But what I am very clear about is I am not an expert in a lot of this stuff. What I have is 4 years of very real lived experience. And one of the things that has got me through those 4 years has been the community. It has been the local community where Joe and I grew up, where I still live, where Mum and Dad still live, where Joe was our MP. You know, she was very clear she only wanted to be the MP for the area she grew up in. And I have been supported by that community and volunteers who have worked tirelessly to create a legacy for Joe, and not just locally. That has happened across the country as well, and indeed across the world to some degree. So I'll talk very briefly about the work of the Joe Cox Foundation pre-COVID, during COVID, and then a little bit looking towards the future. I'm going to try and cram as much in there as possible. Joe's Foundation has 3 strands to it. We do international work, or we support international work is probably a better way of saying it. We have the Joe Cox Memorial Grants that take place in 18 different countries around the world, looking at empowering women and looking at inequalities in communities in various countries around the world. Nationally, we've done quite a lot of work on the civility in public life, the toxicity around public debate, the abuse of people in public life. Those are things that we continue to work on. But the 2 things I think that resonate really with today is the local stuff that we do. and the local stuff that is actually also national stuff, because even though we do very granular community work here, we do it across the whole country. And the heart of that is really the Great Get Together campaign, which we've just had in June, and I'll talk a little bit more about the Great Get Together. But really that localised stuff that we do here in Batley and Spen is really, really important to me, and I think it's one of the things I feel most passionately about. And also the role of Joe's Foundation in having national reach and having a voice in Westminster and the corridors of power, but also really understanding what life's like for normal people in what I call the real world, you know. And I feel a massive disconnect sometimes. I'll go to stuff in Westminster, I'll go to big fancy meetings with people with letters after the names and all that sort of stuff, and I think, take that to Batley, love. Take that to Dewsbury, because people are just going to tell you to bugger off. Yeah, so I think that's kind of a really important role that the organisations have. We have to bridge those gaps and those divides. And I also, again, going back to this cross-sector thing, you know, the first meeting we had with local volunteers was quite intense. There were lots of people in that room. Obviously, this was not long after Joe was killed. There was a lot of passion, there was a lot of upset, there was a lot of emotion. But we got a lot done in a very short space of time. And again, that just shows the vibrancy of the voluntary sector, people who just want to get stuff done. And I love that. That's very much Joe's approach. It's very much my approach. But what there was also a lot of was slagging off the council. So there was a first sort of 20 minutes of people, well, the council should be doing this and the council should be doing that. And then it sort of went a little bit onto the police, and the police should be doing this and the police. And I just said, right, hang on a minute. We can sit here for 2 hours and go on about what people are not doing. We can moan about it, we can whinge about it, or we can say, do you know what are we going to do? What are we going to bring to the party? What are we going to take to the table? And what are we going to go to the council with and say, look at all this amazing stuff, let's work together, let's do some amazing stuff together. Then what we're also going to do is we're going to find the local business people who've got a big heart and quite big pockets, and we're going to get them involved as well. So we're going to go private sector, public sector, voluntary sector, all working together for the good of the community. So that was a real change in mindset for some people, I think. And then within the voluntary sector, there was almost a thing of, well, there's 500 quid coming up. We're going to bid for it. Don't tell them about it. Oh, hang on a minute. Well, I was like, hang on a minute. There's 500 quid. We all want to do something good. Why don't you bid for that 500 quid? Why don't we bid for that other 500 quid? And why don't we do a joint project where we do something that's doubly amazing and fantastic? So that was my sort of real sort of launch into the voluntary sector. And it's been a roller coaster ever since, if I'm honest. So prior to COVID, prior to lockdown, we were planning the Great Get Together. So that was our big sort of national initiative. And obviously then we went into lockdown and everything changed. So we had to do, as many organisations will, as many individuals do, oh my gosh, what do we do? Do we cancel the Great Get Together? Do we postpone the Great Get Together? Or do we crack on and try and make it something really special and actually really more important and more needed than ever? And probably no surprises to anybody who's met me, we decided to do the third of those options. And we said, right, we're going to get on with it and we're going to make it amazing. And we did it. And what was so wonderful to see was on the back of all the community kindness and compassion that we had seen during lockdown, we had a wonderful Great Get Together weekend. Lots of things being done virtually, but equally we didn't want to exclude anyone, so we had lots of small acts of connection and community kindness, whether it was doing jigsaw swaps with neighbours or delivering homemade baking or sending some lovely little postcards that we had designed to people who you might not be able to be with. So the Great Get Together was a hugely successful. I'm so glad that we cracked on. And again, you know, being quite a nimble organisation, being an organisation that responds to what's going on in the country, which I think is also really important, we also set aside doing something else, a new initiative called the Connection Coalition, which some of you may have seen. And what we felt in those early days of lockdown was that there was a real sense of men in suits on telly telling you what you can't do. And what there wasn't was much empathy and understanding for how people were feeling. And there was a real sense of loss. There was the sense of loss for people who tragically lost loved ones, but there was a loss of our freedoms. There was a loss of our connections on a human level. And we thought someone has to do something in that space. So basically we set up this new organisation called the Connection Coalition. And it's for organisations to join and to look at ways we can keep people connected during this crisis. So, you know, we're very lucky. We've got great partners. We partner with the Red Cross, we partner with Mind, Nesta gave us some funding. And now we've got 450 organisations who are part of the Connection Coalition. Big organisations, but also small community organisations like, you know, chatty cafes and knit and natter groups and things like that. So I'm really proud of the Connection Coalition. And I think also coming out of this situation, which hopefully eventually we will do, we have to be looking at loneliness and social isolation, mental health, grief, we have to be looking at these really important issues that so many of us are going to be facing. And I think, you know, we're currently working on a plan for the Connection Coalition. At a very localised level, we got the call from the council, you know, do you want to work with us? Do you want to work with us on how we can deal, you know, with some of the localised problems? And we said, yeah, absolutely, of course we do. But what you found was, you know, and again, no disrespect to the council, but while the council were putting their plan together, people were just doing stuff. So these groups had just popped up all over the place and people were just doing stuff. But what it needed was a little bit of sort of organising. So we said, yeah, of course we will. So we ended up being a bit of a conduit between the council and between some of the COVID groups, the mutual aid groups and the people on the ground. And, you know, it took a couple of weeks to get going into that, but it seemed to work really, really well. So I was really proud. And I basically took my local staff team, which is only sort of 2 2.5 people, you know, in terms of hours, onto that. And I said, right, come off everything else. This is what's needed. Let's crack on with this. And that was great. And again, going back to what was said there about funding, we were very lucky that we've got a very positive relationship with our local council now. And they gave us the money to do that. They gave us some funding. And that was, as Donna was saying, it's about trust. You know, we've built up that trust over the last couple of years. And they were, you know, it's obviously a big thing, isn't it, giving the money away? But they felt, you know, we know that these people are going to do it right. And fingers crossed, we did a good job of that. So that's that. So that's been a bit of judge. Am I out of time?
Yes, you're out of time.
Okay, right. I'm going to say two more things. So 2 more things. One is we are going to be doing a winter get together, and I think it's going to be needed more than ever. So please do get in touch about the great winter get together. Also, I'm going to be looking at developing some project work. I would love to pick your brains. You are the experts, not me. Anybody wants to get in touch about how we can move forward with some of the stuff that needs to be done at local level, please just give me a shout. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jo. I knew you'd be over enthusiastic. I'd like to introduce Heather now, please.
Jo, are we going to put the slides on? There, they're coming, Heather, now. There might just be a little bit of a pause till Jo gets them on. There you go. Is that all right, Heather?
It is, thank you. Okay, so my name's Heather Nelson. I'm the Chief Exec of Black Health Initiative that's based in Leeds in West Yorkshire. We work wherever our funding takes us as we're multi-funded. So at 10 minutes, so I'm going to try and speak fast. I'm going to try and leave my Jamaican accent behind so that you can all understand me without any translations. So here we go. So pre-COVID-19. Okay, so in our opinion, I'm very much going to speak about my experience through Black Health Initiative, but also which is representative of the Black voluntary sector. And I'm very specific in saying Black rather than BAME. I actually don't like the name BAME. I think it's very divisive. It means white and then all the others, when really we're always trying to work together. So that's why I kind of leave it apart. Plus, you know, we have, you know, the South Asian community, the African Caribbean, the Black British, etc., the East Asian. We're all different. We're not a homogenous group. So what might be an issue for one is not an issue for another. So going on to the level sustained community groups. Pre-COVID, I do believe that it was getting stronger. I do believe that there were more small groups actually popping up, and a bit like what Kim's just said, you know, the £500 that was going there to help them do what they wanted to do and to champion the works that they wanted within their community was happening. But it was a bit divisive because it meant that there was a lot of competition there. But it did encourage people who had a new understanding of working together to actually come together. It was getting sustained. Grassroots organisations were actually building on what they were doing. The pendulum had switched from consortiums to actually looking at those organisations, small and medium, that were working within their communities, had their specialities, and were actually making a difference because they had the trust of those that they were serving, but also then linked them to the larger either charities or the statutory bodies who then could have access to them. So we no longer had to use the term hard to reach, under the radar, and all the other things that meant that people said that they couldn't reach us when we could as specialists. It also meant that we had effective partnerships. So the statutory bodies understood that we could actually reach those people that they said they couldn't reach, and therefore they were funding them. The issue was that the funding was going to the larger third sector rather than those that were very much grassroots and had their immediate access. It did actually mean that the smaller charities and organisations were getting sub-funded by the larger ones to ensure that they were meeting their actual targets, which in itself was an issue. Now, let's go on to during COVID-19. Thank you. During COVID-19, as we all know, the government came out with different support initiatives for us. So there was the furlough scheme. There were grants for larger charities to continue their work if they couldn't do their fundraising, which was predominantly outside. It was very much about getting together and raising money. There was also loans. The loans, however, weren't okay for the smaller to medium organisations, because it banked on the fact that you'd be able to pay back the monies, and that was very precarious for some of the smaller to medium organisations. The local third sector response to COVID-19 was very, in my opinion, very adaptable. Straight away, as soon as there was a lockdown, they galvanised, the volunteers came together, and I think Cormac said this, it was very much about local people understanding the local needs, the third sector organisations that were there understanding what was needed, didn't bother looking at policies and procedures in regards to let's do a template, let's then look at forward planning, but actually started the work. So you had people setting up the food banks, people cooking like BHI. We started cooking, we were doing 150 meals over 2 days, because although people were distributing emergency bags of food, there was many people who weren't able to feed themselves, people with dementia, people who had mobility issues, etc. So very much going on and adapting what they were doing. Very much so we used virtual. So for the younger generation, there was very much about virtual groups and support sessions. We used checking in programs where you check in with friends and relatives to make sure that they were okay. And that still continues. And I'm sure it will continue to a certain degree post-COVID. So while we were doing that, am I okay for time? I'm really rushing this through, so my apologies. So while we were doing that, and while we all concentrated on the pandemic, what also happened was the impact of the murder of George Floyd. Now, for many, especially those of us who are Black, that really hit us. And for most of us who I've been speaking to, not just locally, but nationally and internationally, it actually was like another trauma. So we were dealing, in essence, with two things that were really traumatic to those communities and those who felt a connection, either because they were male, they were Black, they came from Black community. And then we had some of those who were allies who stood at the side and actually said, this is not on. Many people look at racism or racist behaviour to be very violent. While we saw that murder and it was very explicit, racism is an everyday occurrence for many of us who are Black or brown people, and microaggression is there, institutional racism is there, but yet still we're expected to continue on and continue with the work and be productive without actually recognizing that this has a psychological impact on those of us who are actually going through this trauma. What are we doing to actually support our Black staff? And that's something that I know some of my white colleagues, people that we've worked with, have asked me, what can I do so it's not tokenistic? Putting out a statement's all very good, but then what actions are you taking? Are you making sure, if you're an employer, that your Black employees are okay? Do they need any additional support? You as yourself, are you calling out racism when you see it? It's not just about your policy. Most of us have equal opportunity policies, diversity policies, but what are we doing with them? And actually, what are we doing as individuals to make society a fairer place for everybody? So while we're talking about that, we're also trying to balance the work that we're doing. And as a Black organisation, BHI has been doing that, balancing what we are doing in response to COVID, but also dealing with the trauma that many from the community are coming in with, which is mental ill health, anxiety from the older people who are scared to go out, anxiety for the older people who don't know whether to get their older people and vulnerable people who don't know whether to get the flu jab, because they're now hearing misinformation about the flu jab and the COVID jab being integrated, so therefore they don't want that. Also, the young Black men who are coming to us because they want counselling and support because of the disproportionate stop and search, victimisation that they're feeling. So we should, as partners, if we're all working together, recognise that different organisations and different individuals are actually having additional issues that are compounding the impact of COVID-19. in regards to post-COVID-19, am I still doing okay? Yes? Okay, I'm still doing okay.
1 minute.
1 minute, right? Okay. In regards to post-COVID-19, let's have a look at the sustainability of the third sector. Now, Professor Hill just said that Donna said about trusting the third sector. You do need that trust because we are able, we are more than capable, and we do know what's going on within the communities that we serve. Those that are most marginalised have been the most vulnerable during this period, and it's organisations within the third sector that can do the immediate response and then continue with the long-term response with our potential partners. What we have to look at as well is that we don't lose the richness of the diversity of the third sector, because those that are smaller and more specialised and actually dealing with communities of interest are usually the ones who are struggling with the funding and the finances. And the emergency funding was usually 3 to 6 months, and it's coming to a close. So we really need to show value of those in the third sector by investing in them and investing in them quickly so that we can maintain the work that we've been doing during COVID and actually progress post-COVID. We don't want to lose that richness. And I think I've come up to my last minute.
Thank you very much, Heather. That was very passionate as well. I'll just move straight on to Vicky, please, and then we'll do some questions at the end.
Hi, brilliant. Thank you, everyone. Is my sound all right? Can someone give me a thumbs up if the sound's all right? Brilliant. My name is Vicky. I'm the Chief Exec of a fantastic organisation called Project 6 in Keighley. So we've gone from Batley to Leeds to Keighley this afternoon. We're going to talk to you a bit about our experience of supplementing community resilience in Keighley. And I've blatantly stolen that from Cormac because I think that's an absolutely brilliant phrase to use, actually. We're a medium-sized charity. We work across Yorkshire. We used to say we worked with people with multiple complex needs. Now we say we work with people living with multiple complex disadvantage as well. So we're locally rooted in communities. We've been delivering in 30 years for Keighley, 35 in Sheffield, 40 years in Doncaster, and we try and help people help themselves. So a bit about Keighley and us pre-COVID. So when John Cooper Clarke starts dissing your town, that you know you're a bit in trouble. So to give you a bit of an overview of what life was like in Keighley before COVID, in March, we had a journalist from the Financial Times come and spend a few days with us. She described us as being down on our luck, falling squarely in the category of being left behind by, and that's true. Keighley is always, it's a small northern town. It's like many other small northern towns. It had industry, it lost its industry, gained a heroin problem. In the cycle of boom and bust, we seem to go bust quicker and it takes longer for the boom to come back. So actually we spend a disproportionate amount of time struggling. We have significant health inequalities and health inequities. We've got challenges around transport. It's £9 to get to Leeds. And if you only earn £9 an hour, that's a significant chunk of your earnings. And we've got our fair share of racism, structural microaggression, racism, all the stuff that Heather was just talking about there as well. And that's something that we absolutely need to tackle. The health inequalities, if you're born over the hill in Ilkley, you'll live 8 years longer and you'll have 21 healthy life years longer as well. So they're significant, like a lot of areas across our patch as well. We've featured in the top 10 of the worst places to live and Britain's worst town as well. But I love Keighley. Sorry, can we go back a little bit? Back to the previous slide, because there are some really positive things. We've got a thriving community sector, a thriving BCS with small, medium, grassroots BCS organisations. We've got local leaders who genuinely want to empower and see flourishing communities. We don't have too much of the big organisations coming and settling on top of us. We've got some beautiful buildings, parks and assets. We've got the Worth Valley Railway. We've had an arts festival last year, and we've got some amazing people. The only positive thing that came out of that article was said by Kelly, who a woman who uses our services, and she said that Keighley was a hard town, but it has an uncommon amount of kindness, and that was absolutely evident when it came to COVID coming to Keighley. So next slide, please. Our existing our community and social response was absolutely immediate. We have really well functioning local and hyper-local systems at neighbourhood level, at street level almost as well. And we worked really, really quickly to kind of mobilise the response, because looking back, everything happened so quickly. I just wrote Project 6's kind of 100-day story. And within, from 10 days, we've gone to being worried about what was happening in Italy to being in total lockdown. And it seemed to take a decade at the time, but it only took 10 days. So we really, really quickly identified food poverty was going to be an absolutely huge issue. Hundreds of people and families were going to go hungry in Keighley. There's a lot of work kind of in the grey economy. There's a lot of work of things like taxi drivers and restaurants, and their income just went overnight. So because we were well connected and we knew who our community leaders were and our groups were and our grassroots people and our neighbourhoods were, we were able to, within a matter of days, form a fantastic food poverty pathway. So we got the local leaders together. We as an organisation opened our front door really, really widely. Our crisis phone line became a crisis phone line for the whole of Keighley. We redeployed 4 staff internally to staff it. We created a referral route, which was supported by the community, supported by other VCS organisations, grassroots ones, into the Salvation Army, who were already doing an amazing job of the food poverty work as well. We redeployed 3 staff to them. Somebody gave us a minibus to help sort the food out. We created all sorts of systems and procedures, and the rest of the community came and talked to us, and we had a halal food pathway, a culturally sensitive food pathway for refugees, a vegetarian food pathway. People turned up to help us translate information. People turned up to help us answer the phone in different community languages. We worked with the army. The army came and helped us work up our logistics so we could increase everything by 4-fold. We saw a 400% increase in our crisis service calls and 200% increases in our support services for the most vulnerable as well. We did it at pace. We did this absolutely at pace, and we did it really, really well. And then the statutory services turned up about a week later. What do we need to do about food? We've done it. It's there. It's all singing, all dancing, all across the community. So the community response to this was absolutely fantastic. And it wasn't just fantastic in Keighley, it was fantastic everywhere. We're just one organisation, one small part of the patch, and this was happening across the whole of the area as well. So next slide, please. So, but this crisis is not over. We've known that these issues were around for a decade. In fact, it's barely starting. The social impact on our communities may well be felt for more decades as well. The poorest people will be hurt the most. We're looking at potentially significant unemployment and in-work poverty. We know within our crisis service that it's increased by 400%. It's levelled off now, but we know that food poverty is going to be less of an issue. But in the coming weeks, universal credit sanctions will start happening again. People have had support around and protection around their rent, around their utility bills. People have taken out loans. People have paid for things on credit cards. People have adapted in a whole different way. And actually that there will be consequences to some of that. So we're expecting our crisis services to need to function at that level to support people with these coming needs as well. The other issue is that we know there is going to be a significant mental health crisis in this country. We know our well-being is being affected as citizens, within our communities, within our organisations. We're recognising it now, but we know from the evidence that this will hit us 3 to 6 months' time. And my question for health leaders is, are we prepared to throw the same amount of resource at the NHS for this spike as we were for the spike for the physical need as well? Because we're going to need to. We need to be prepared, because this could be absolutely significant. But we've got a once in a generation opportunity, and that is to put the power back into the hands of the communities and the citizens. The spirit and the resilience and the compassion that they've shown has been absolutely extraordinary. We did a piece on Look North straight after lockdown. It featured us talking through what we were doing, and it spoke to some of the people that use our services. and they were talking about how they'd experienced lockdown in a house without windows or with mold on the walls, without any friends, without any electricity, without any ability to cook any food. And from the next few days onwards, we had people sending cards, we had people sending money. The next day, a woman turned up from Morrison's, 2 shopping bags with her, full of bread rolls, bacon, sausages, eggs, because she wanted to do something for the people. And people were coming out and saying, this isn't right, we need to do something. We've shone a light on it, we've activated this compassion, and we absolutely need to act on it. At a local level, we really need to honestly listen to and understand the structural causes of poverty, which are what underpins health inequities, and also structural racism, and we need to act on them because we've already got the evidence. Michael Marmot's written about this for the last 10 years. David Lammy's written a report. We don't need any more reports. We need to act, and our communities are ready to do that because they're resilient, they're organised, they're compassionate, they know what they need to do. And we need to, in order to do this, we need a really strong, thriving VCS organisation, from the larger organisations to the grassroots ones, so we can work alongside our communities to increase that resilience and sustainability. And we need to make the left shift happen. And we've got some ideas in Erdal, Wharfdale and Craven how we can make that happen, but it's absolutely imperative that we take this opportunity to do it, because if we're not going to do it now, then when will we do it? Thanks. I've just put there some reading and some reports and things about the sector and our response to it as well, which other people might find interesting.
Thank you very much, Vicky. I'd just like to say thank you to all our speakers. Watch out, Keighley, there's going to be a day trip of people going across to see great things that are going on in Keighley. Now that we're out of lockdown, we can all go over and have a day trip. But seriously, I think we've seen from all 3 speakers some absolute passion, enthusiasm, drive and energy. And I think we've just shown how the VCS, the communities, people have got on with it and got away from having to do it in a particular format because they've just got on and said, things need to change, we need to make things happen. I don't think we've got any particular questions coming through unless Karen wants to correct me on that. But
no, I just think
there was a question.
Sorry.
From Helen. I thought there was a question from Helen that might be worth asking, actually.
Helen, do you want to ask your question? Helen Hunter, is that?
Yes. Yeah, it was something about interesting to think about different places in leadership, Helen, that you'd popped into the chat box.
Yeah, that's so it's really interesting to listen to Vicky talk about how in Keighley everything was mobilised really quickly by a voluntary sector organisation that was able to get something really robust, well thought through, that considered the different needs of the community. I work in different systems. I think there's been a greater influence from local authority in the areas where I work. And I just think it's interesting to think about what transition needs to take place for it to feel more organic, for the voluntary sector to just have that responsibility from the outset, rather than feeling like there's that need for statutory organisations to be involved in something that the VCS can do so brilliantly.
Thank you, Helen. That's a good challenge. And somebody else in the chat box, I think it was Mike, came up with, it's great to see this self-organisation, but the danger is that we're going to go back to being more shut down on just getting on with it, and meetings creeping in that perhaps don't need to happen. We've got away from some of these unnecessary meetings because we've just had to do it, and we need to be mindful of that. I think it was Mike Chitty that came up with that one. Is there anybody else that would like to just offer any? Rob, you came in probably on the last 3 speakers, did you?
I did, yeah, which was
challenge them back to.
No, I think it's I mean, the first thing I'd say is that as ever, there's a narrative, and I think you mentioned Mike Chitty. I remember Mike Chitty telling me a story about one of in the early days he was asked by one of his bosses to go to Newcastle to find out what's great about Newcastle, and he came back saying how great it was. And then he was asked to go to Liverpool and find out what's terrible about Liverpool, and he came back and said how terrible it was. If you looked at both of them at the time, they were both, you know, port cities that were facing significant mass unemployment with their own character and culture, which was probably quite similar. But framing the question and the narrative meant that you came back with a different view. And I think if you look at the whole of this session, what we're seeing is if you start from the narrative that people are victims and need our help, people are victims and need our help. If you start from a narrative that actually people have got loads of assets and get on with their lives quite well, thanks, despite us, we might actually be able to work with them and get things done by them that we can support, you get a different outcome. And listen to three fantastic women tell three fantastic stories about three places. Most people would say, you know, what, Batley, Keighley and Chapeltown are going to be the answer to all of our problems, are going to come from Batley, Keighley and Chapeltown. Most people would write Batley, Keighley and Chapeltown off, as I would be full of people who haven't got anything to offer. But I loved what, you know, Vicky said about, I love Keighley. You know, it's the worst place to live in Britain, but I love Keighley. You know, worst place to live stuff's got to stop. So my question coming out of all of that for the speakers really is, you know, as a partnership that has VCS members at the board, in the partnership, at the executive in the partnership, in each place, what do we do to make sure that people can see that this is about those assets and that the third sector can be supported? What practically can we do to make it better? I don't know who wants to go first. Heather?
I think Sue Crow wants to come in. She's got a pen up as though it's a hand. So do you want to chip in?
I really wanted, what really resonated earlier on, and the three last speakers were wonderful, but what resonated was what Professor Donna Hall said about, you know, hospitals and other massive organisations can have £1 billion budgets and they get away with overspend, but the voluntary sector get hammered if they've got a £10 underspend. There's not the same sort of trust. And I think one of the things, Rob, is to have more trust. I mean, over the last 14 weeks, because of that shorthand, Hilary, in just allowing people to run with things, right? Okay, we know you can do this, off you go. That isn't how it was before. I think we need to have more of that. There does need to be structure and accountability, but that new trust has been really refreshing for us as a sector. And we've been able to demonstrate that being there on the ground, having access to people in communities, and we're in communities ourselves, means we can feed back very quickly about what's working and what isn't. And I mean, the tablet project, Keeping Connected, showed that, and I think the digital connectivity is something we shouldn't lose, among other things. So it is that, keep that renewed trust in the voluntary sector, because they can be trusted, they know what they're doing. So that's what I have to say, really.
So
Thank you, Sue.
We've got common cause there, Sue, and if you were sat in the meetings that we have with the centre, we said exactly the same thing to them. Just leave us alone and let us get on with it.
Yeah. Can I just say as well, Rob, just in response to that, is that and again, it's kind of balances on trust. It's about the monitoring, the over monitoring of the work that the third sector does and having to collate that. Of course, we've got to evidence, but we can evidence in such different ways rather than looking at the number crunching, because a lot of our work is more intense, especially when it's going out to communities of interest, where it might be smaller numbers, but the impact is greater, and that has to be valued as well, I would suggest.
That's very, very true. Somebody earlier mentioned measure the right things. I think Vicky wanted to come in.
Yeah, I totally agree with both of those points, and I really agree with what Sue was saying. It's about trust. It's also about power. It's about as so many of these conversations it's about recognising your power and your privilege and your platform. And for me, you grow that by giving it away. And it becomes so much more powerful when it's dispersed. And I think that's what we need to see from our leaders is a willingness giving up of that power and putting it where it really needs to be.
Ashley, do you want to come in?
Thanks, Hilary. First of all, these have been an incredibly powerful set of presentations, very thought-provoking, as was the comments in the chat box. I've really enjoyed it, but it's given me a lot of food for thought. And just building on Rob's question, the points that are made, I think personally I was feeling quite depressed a few years ago about the direction of travel I thought this country was going culturally, and things that were happening over the other side of the Atlantic in particular. I was getting quite worried about actually we were retrenching things that in relation to the EU. And I think there is something about how COVID, despite the emergency, it does give us an opportunity to really reset. And I think, and Rob was referring to this on a briefing earlier today, as an ICS, and I'm part of the ICS partnership team, I think it is about how, as an ICS with our other ICS leaders elsewhere in the country, we have a different conversation with government about where resources go going forward. But there's also something in the presentation, and particularly in Donna's, about the language we use to engage other people. And I think there is something about when we're wanting to engage more maybe traditional parts of the NHS, this might not be what we want to do, but actually using a language that resonates with them about how it ticks the right metrics for the NHS, that this will help you do what you want to do. And actually it is one, and one of the great things I think about the ICS is it is one pot of money. We're moving away from competing about pots of money, but I think we're on a journey, and I agree with everything the presenters have said. This is a golden opportunity to seize this. And if we don't seize it, and I think there's a lot we could do in an ICS to support that, as well as what we can encourage government to do. I think we have to seize it, because that left shift, and I've seen it, I've been working here 4 months, I've seen that in all the conversations I've been part of. There's a real passion to really embed the left shift for the long term. So I just want to say thank you again to the presenters.
Thank you, Ashley. Kim, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to sort of say a slightly nuanced point to the idea of letting the voluntary sector get on with it, which I do think is important to some degree, but I actually think it's more about collaboration. It's more about genuine collaboration between the sectors and between different organisations, because none of us have got all the answers, but we've probably all got some of the answers. So if we work together across sectors, you know, if someone's going to fund us, I mean, we've had a grant nationally from the Spirit of 2012, which is the legacy organisation from the Olympics, and we're actually working very closely with them. They're not pestering us and they're not bothering us, or they're not, you know, but what they're doing is, you know, how can we support you? So I think if funders look at themselves as being supportive, and we look at each other as allies rather than just someone giving someone else money to go off and do something, I think that's really powerful. So it's a slightly different version of it being one person who's in charge or the other person in charge, but I think that collaboration is actually really important.
I can see Donna, did you want to come in?
I'm sorry, I can't use the chat. I'm only on my phone and I can't work out how to use the chat function. I'm sorry. But just something really practical that I don't know whether it's relevant in West Yorkshire and Harrogate that worked for us in Wigan, was a lot of the time people didn't know the activities and the community organisations that were out there. So we developed this thing with the community and a local business called the Community Book, which was like a digital tool that just mapped everything that was out there, so that you know, people could, there was mutual aid between different community organisations and different neighbourhoods. They could share if one wanted a gazebo or some chairs, you know, they could, or needed some help on a particular event, they could just advertise it and promote it, and it was all connected. We'd never had anything like that before, and it's self-populating as well. So if you're doing something, you can put a plea out for support and help. And also, it was every GP practice had it there. They all had it on their computer, on the Surface Pros, all the social workers had it, so they could tell people in local areas what was going on and try and help them to access things that they may not know was on the doorstep.
Yeah, thanks, Donna. That's a really good point. It's about knowledge, isn't it, and sharing. Mel, I'm going to bring you in for the final point before Rob and I have to wrap up this session because it's 1:30. Mel?
Okay, thank you. I was just struck. I was trying to look down the participant list, and I've, as a relative newcomer, I know quite a number of people. But what I was looking for was some sort of my acute chief exec colleagues, and I don't think I could find any. And I just wanted to make an observation that relates to Rob and I were on a call, a round table this week. with Baroness Lawrence about the up-and-coming review of the inequalities in relation to COVID on BAME communities, or pardon the terminology for those that are not comfortable with that. And Rob made the point about it's okay having BAME networks and having those conversations, but I think a member of staff said to Rob, it's okay us having all these conversations, but we're not the ones with the problem. It's everybody else out there. So who's having the conversation with everybody else out there? And I just, sometimes it does disappoint me when I look down and see, you know, are we really preaching to a lot of the converted in this session, because it's a self-selected group of people who are like-minded and supportive of this, and how do we get these messages over to other people who can help influence and facilitate the kind of promulgation of these brilliant ideas and approaches? Just an observation.
Thanks, Mel. That's a really challenging thought, and I know Karen and her team will take that forward. They're so good at publicising things. They'll make sure that everybody sees this as far and wide as they possibly can, but it is a good challenge. I'm going to round up because it's 13:32 by my computer, and we've probably all got other Zoom meetings and things to do, if even not go and get some lunch. I'd just like to say thank you very much to all the guest speakers and to all the contributors in the chat box, because there's been some fantastic things, and I think Karen's team will be making sure that everybody can get to see those. I think the energy, the passion, the enthusiasm have been overwhelming. I think the things that have come out of this is about trust, about giving hope, about being kind, and about listening to people and really valuing everybody's contribution. And the solution is back in the person and not always in the organisation. But as Kim very rightly said, we have to work as a complete system, and it does take all of us to do that. So I'd just like to say thank you, and thank you to Karen. Rob, did you want to come in for the final word? Yeah,
I just finish on 2 points. The first one is that one, Mike and I having a bit of dialogue about what the ICS is. And again, there's a mindset that says the ICS is the structure that sits on top of everything. My philosophical point is that we're all the ICS. The ICS is a true partnership, and it doesn't matter if you know you're in it or not, in a way, if you know you're in it or not. But the things that happen in the neighbourhood, the things that happen in the street, the thing that happens in the town, the place, West Yorkshire, are all part of the system. It's called a system. It's not an organisation. And if we, as Kim said, you know, if we see the amplification of the things we're doing together as what will have the biggest impact on people and with people, then we've all got to see ourselves as the system. And you might not be able to talk about the jargon, but you should feel connected to something. That itself is connected to something. It's that Myron Rogers stuff about connecting the system to more of itself. And I think that that's what we're building. And the fact that any voluntary sector organisation in West Yorkshire can have a voice at the highest levels gives you an input into decision making. What we need to do, I think, is to make sure that all of us see the assets that are in front of us within that partnership and recognise their power. And if anybody was in any doubt of how powerful they are, all you have to do is watch back what we've heard today. You know, whether it's Cormac, I love what Cormac said about social justice, you know, and Donna's always absolutely fantastic upon what happens when you give people a chance and you back the right thing, you know, and you know, the three speakers we just heard, as I said, hold the key to our future, really. So I think the final thing I'd just say is also thank you. I always learn stuff from this. It always inspires me. You've given me energy, and that itself comes back to that point about power. And I think Vicky said it, you know, the more power you give away, the more power there is. It's not a zero-sum game, you know, it just gets bigger. So thank you, everybody. That was brilliant.
Bye, everyone. Have a good weekend.